This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily Now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Friday, March the 29th, 2024. It's raining in San Francisco, late March, rather unusual. And it's raining in Palo Alto, at least according to Keith Teare, whose newsletter, That Was the Week newsletter on tech is entitled Data-Driven Investing. And he begins his editorial saying, "It's Friday morning in Palo Alto. Rain is drizzling down my windows and the weekend will be wet." Sounds very depressing, Keith.
Well, except if you're English, you actually like the sound of rain. Don't you, Andrew?
Well, I actually rather enjoy it. I like the fact that it upsets other people. How has it influenced, though, your editorial on data investing? I have to admit, I'm always a bit skeptical of this concept of data investing. I mean, it's a truism. You only invest when you have the data. So what's the big deal about it?
Well, there's all kinds of data. So of course, every single investor who makes an investment, there's two things you need to know about them. One is they have a goal in mind, and secondly, they have some kind of data that supports their decision. So data is everywhere, but that use of the word data is usually reduced down to what venture capitalists call due diligence. So they might get the company's finances, they might do background checks on the founders, they might do some market analysis to decide whether that company is in a high growth industry where the upside is unlimited. That is data. But what this week's stories that people have written, and that's why the title's there. There's a lot of content this week written by.
And people. I have to say, Keith, I mean, for people watching, your AI artist is getting worse. It looks like a sort of a swirl of different colors, almost a nightmarish ice cream cone. Where'd you get this imagery from?
So so you know what happened is I asked ChatGPT. I gave it my editorial, but I pressed enter before it got the editorial, and all it got from me was give me grays and reds, shades of gray and red.
I don't think ChatGPT is ever going to become Rembrandt. Anyway, so we got terrible art, we've got miserable weather in Palo Alto of all places in late March, and we have data investing. What's happening this week on the data investing front? I know you were quite influenced by an interesting piece from our friend Mike Butcher at TechCrunch about data finding that unicorn founders are underdogs, quote unquote, and that female founders are rising. What's interesting about that data?
Well, the first is most of the people who believe in data-driven investing have this assumption that founders can be scored based on where they went to school, and that the likelihood of outcomes, for example, Ilya, who's a professor at Stanford, has a whole thesis about where founders went to school correlated to unicorn production. And what this study that Mike Butcher is writing about says is that the strongest signal is that they're underdogs. And by underdogs, he means not white males that are American by birth. He says there's lots of immigrants, there's lots of brown and black skinned people.
And this was a Defiance report.
Yeah.
From a company, a research company, Defiance Capital. I have to admit, again, a little bit of skepticism. You include yourself in that because you're an immigrant, but you're hardly an underdog. Certainly in the United States. Well, you came here as a successful entrepreneur. There's no underdog quality to that.
Andrew, if I took you to Eastfield Estate in Scarborough.
Yeah, but that's another issue. I mean,
I'm definitely not. I definitely wasn't rated to be a success.
Well, okay. Well, let me include myself then. If I, as an entrepreneur, although I'm a serially failed entrepreneur, I would be included as an underdog here because I'm an immigrant to the US, and there's nothing about me that's the underdog.
You know, I beg to differ. I think a lad from the Jewish North London district is not necessarily an overdog. You had to struggle somehow or other to get where you are in life.
My struggle. Oi. No, that's the point is that these categories are a little vague. So
well, that in a way is my point, Andrew. The vagueness of the categories means that it's super hard to use data intelligence to find them, and that's why I put it in. Mike, in a way, is saying, look, the facts are so weird that actually you couldn't discover these winners by doing data-driven work prior to them being winners. You wouldn't have been able to find them. So I put it there because it puts a question mark over how realistic data-driven discovery is. And so I thought it was a good...
isn't it sort of, the thing with these, knowing the ILIA research at Stanford, I mean, everybody knows that a lot of VCs invest in Stanford or Harvard grads. So that's a no-brainer.
It is, but it doesn't correlate to success in the way they think it does. I mean, there is some correlation, obviously. Some minority number of big winners went to good schools like Stanford. So there's obviously some correlation. But the real question is it better than what you would do by, randomly making decisions based on companies you meet? And the answer is no, it isn't. That's why the other article about the S&P 500 is so important.
Right, and that was an interesting piece on the S&P 500. You shows that if between 2010 and 2020, had you invested $100,000, S&P 500 return would have been 364K, and hedge funds would have been 160K. What about VCs? Where's the VC element here?
Well, the average VC would have done far worse than both of these. The top, 5% would have been as good as the hedge funds.
So that tells us that it's not wise to back startups or to try to become an investor. You're just better off putting your money in the stock market.
No, it doesn't actually say that. It says that if you are going to put money in the stock market, you're most likely to do better if you put it into an index. That's probably the anchor point that I believe that's true.
Well, most people put it in indexes because it's easier and simpler.
And safer. So now in venture capital, there is no such thing as an index. You can't put your money in an index. So if you're going to do venture capital at all, you are stock picking in the way that the hedge funds do. So you're mostly going to underperform the average when you do that. And therein lies why the rest of the articles in this AI section this week are interesting, because they're all people trying to beat the average using data.
Which is always the case with investing, isn't it? I mean, if you can beat the average by 0.1%, then you become very rich. And if you don't, you lose all your money.
Well, that's always the goal. But what's happening now is that being successful is becoming possible. So in the past, that goal was hardly ever met. But the point of the editorial and the stories is we're now getting to a point where a data-driven approach is showing real value.
Well, you would say that, Keith, because of Signal Rank. I mean, that's what you do. So
yeah, but even though I would say that, you've got to challenge me about whether it's true. And if I would say that and it's true, which I think it is, then that's quite.
Well, going back to, I mean, in a simple sense, I mean, if you're putting your money into the S&P 500 in an index fund through your broker, and go to Merrill Lynch or many other places to do that, why try to beat the market in a more sophisticated way in what you're trying to do at Signal Rank?
Well, let's start with the fact that there is an asset class called venture capital, and it is their job to invest money and return more than they invested. So it doesn't really matter what I would do personally, but what we're assessing here is whether the venture asset class can be improved using data. And of course, it it should want the answer to be yes, if it's possible, because that's the job of the people in venture capital. Their job is to turn money into more money and return it and then do it again. So that tees up the question very well. Andre Reterath is in this week's newsletter a lot. He's based in Germany, and he runs data-driven VC newsletter, and he runs a VC fund called Early Bird. He's on the record for a long time talking about how to find what venture capitalists call alpha. And alpha is, the very best outcomes, using data as a filter in the selection process. So he's in there. Now, I don't think there's any evidence yet that he has been able to succeed at doing that. He's a strong advocate of it, but and I may be wrong. I haven't seen his outcome numbers. So I'm not sure he can do it, but it felt to me like this was a perfect moment for me to disclose the work I've been working on this week, which is building the next version of SignalRank, where I think we do it. We actually deliver on the promise. And so Andre and 2 or 3 other writers, plus SignalRank, are in the newsletter to compare and contrast approaches and likelihood of success.
Well, the other news, Keith, this week is that Sam Bankman-Fried got sentenced to 25 years in prison. He used to promise that he knew how to beat the system. I'm not suggesting you're the next Sam Bankman-Fried, but what does this story tell us about promises of guys like SBF that they know how to beat the system?
Well, I think it's fair to say his promises turned out to be true. What he was accused of was illegality when things went bad. But now that we're, a year or more past those events, it turns out that the investors in FTX are going to get their money back and then some, because the market in Bitcoin and other derivatives came back. But he still committed the crimes he committed, in his attempt to either cover up or save a bad outcome.
A few months ago, we had the SBF conversation. I said to you, the guy's obviously guilty and he deserves to go to jail. And you said, well, he hasn't been tried yet. Let's wait to see what happens. Would you acknowledge that he's guilty and deserved a long prison term?
I would acknowledge that he's guilty, and he had his moment to prove he wasn't and failed. So clearly he's guilty. But I think what he's guilty of is really bad judgment correlated to something less bad, which was an attempt to save a sinking ship. So the 25 years, if you compare that to the 110 years, which would have been the maximum sentence, but a lot more than the 5 years that would have been the minimum, one imagines that the judge strongly felt that the guilt was stronger than.
I mean, what's your take on the argument that he was trying to do good and that he was funneling some of the money to effective altruism, and that he certainly was no Bernie Madoff buying jewels and cars and real estate? No,
he definitely is not a Bernie Madoff. He's more of
isn't saying much.
He's on the spectrum, I would imagine, and from what I see, and I think he thinks he was trying to make things better. I don't think he was thinking, I'm going to steal this money for myself. So, his awareness of the law and the lines he crossed seems to have been extremely poor in doing that. And so he made some judgments that were illegal, and he's been found guilty for that. But if you're his parents who are distraught, I think you would think of him as, a kind of a challenged good person as opposed to a bad person.
Well, there's an element culturally also of farce here, where both parents teach at Stanford Law School. They teach tax law. they must have known that he was skirting the law, if not breaking it. Some people have accused them of being involved in this. Has the SBF, you're in Palo Alto, even if it's raining today, Keith, has this had any impact on how people think about their supposedly brilliant children and their startup endeavors?
I think the answer is no. I mean, it's interesting. I have a friend who's in another part of the world who resigned from a very top financial institution this week in order to pursue a career that is in the crypto space. And this person is a very stable, smart, intelligent person who believes that his income, which is constrained in his current job, will become unconstrained as he makes this move. So crypto still is attractive.
Is that your warning to this unnamed fellow that he should be a little bit more realistic?
I think he's figured that out. I think he's grown up, so he'll make his own moves. But he does have children and a family, and he's taking a lot of risk. And crypto, therefore, still can do that. It can still attract talent, and that's because the promise of the upside is still very strong, as it is with data, by the way.
In other news of the week, leaving aside SBF, some interesting stuff, Keith, about Apple. A couple of three pieces on Apple in that was the week newsletter. Two in particular that I was intrigued by, about the EU share of Apple's global revenue and whether or not Apple might simply say to the EU, it's not worth it. We're going to just leave the market. It's only 10% of the market. Is that conceivable that Apple would just shut the door on Europe, on the EU at least?
Well, so it's 7% of their global revenues. Not Europe, the EU is 7% of their global revenues. And if the EU is fining them more than 7% of their global revenues, which it is, then pure economics will say, let's not be in the EU, which would deny EU citizens access to Apple hardware and software unless they buy it outside. So I don't think it's a crazy idea that they could do that. MG Siegler engaged with that story in one of the other articles, and he definitely gives it some credibility, as does Daring Fireball.
The Gruber, but particularly Gruber is doing it from. He seems to always be in Apple's pocket one way or the other. I mean, it would be a very dramatic move. It would involve them shutting down all their stores. You wouldn't be able to have an iPhone in Europe. You wouldn't be able to own a Mac. How would this work?
Well, but the real story here probably is how irrational the EU is when it comes to innovation and technology. And I think this would probably end up being true for Google and lots of other companies. I doubt it's just an Apple thing. The EU has taken on the mantle of fighting big tech to preserve the interests of its citizens. And what these articles expose is that there's a contradiction at the heart of that, because the EU isn't important enough for the fines it's wielding. The fines it's wielding, by the way, are enormous, because they fine companies based on their global revenue, and they fine them a percentage of their global revenue, even though the EU is just the EU. So the EU, the audacity of the EU in taking on big tech is very likely to backfire one way or another. Whether it means Apple won't be in Europe, I think, is a detail that doesn't really detract from the irrationality of the EU in how it's proceeding. And of course, our own FTC and DOJ seem to love the EU approach and are doing their very best in a very different way, because they're more savvy about what is legal and what isn't legal. They're not attacking these companies for the same things the EU is, but they are attacking them. And
so what would you say to people who see the EU as the only series of states actually standing up to big tech? You think that's not true?
Well, it is true. The real question is it smart?
And is it smart in business terms or in ethical terms?
does it serve the citizens of Europe in any way at all? Like the fact that Apple has to drop the Lightning connector in favor of a USB-C. Who really cares? I mean,
yeah, no one cares about that. But I was thinking if, I mean, it's still very, very hard to imagine. It would be a massive, massive development. But let's say Apple or Google or Amazon pulled out of the EU. That would offer enormous opportunities for EU entrepreneurs, wouldn't it?
I doubt that, because they'd have to come up. If they could do something better than Apple, they already would be. You know,
That's not the point. I mean, if Apple's not there, then it gives them an opportunity to sell phones or app stores or
yeah, they'll sell Android
services.
but I guarantee those European citizens who are able to will still buy iPhones. They just won't buy them in the EU. They'll pay more because the iPhone's better. They want it.
So it become like the old Soviet Union. People be smuggling in jeans, but rather than jeans, it's iPhones.
It is like the Soviet Union. I mean, it's a
What, the EU?
Well,
when was the last time you went there?
The EU government, from a regulatory point of view, let's be specific. I'm not making broad statements here, but from a regulatory point of view, it's a top-down bureaucracy acting without any mandate from its citizens.
You're saying that the government of the EU,
the government of the EU,
is equivalent to the Soviet Union.
Well, it's a centralized authority taking decisions.
You're beginning to sound like Mrs. Thatcher, Keith.
I don't know about
that. Or
that
some of the other Brexit people. So are you suggesting that it was wise for the British to pull out?
I empathize with those Brits who felt the EU was some kind of an overlord. I do not empathize with the nationalistic lobby that was part of Brexit, but the part that believes the EU is kind of a top-down overlord making decisions that it really has no democratic mandate for, that I agree with.
Do you think that Apple, though, even, I mean, I understand the point, well, maybe it's not worth it economically for us to be in Europe, but it's more than just economics. There's the value of having beautiful Apple stores in London and Paris and Rome. So it's hard to imagine, even in the worst case scenario, that Apple would simply pack its bags and leave the EU, isn't it?
Well, remember, Tim Cook started life as a CFO. And if you're earning 7%, but they're fining you 10%, you know, you're paying to be in Europe. You're not making a cent. You're paying to be in Europe. And instead of them taxing you, they're fining you to get at your global revenues. I don't know that you can sustain that. Your shareholders actually should be angry with you if you do, because you're getting zero out of it. And I think the lesson here is the EU's got to become a little bit more smart about its fine scale.
Well, I don't think the EU would be particularly concerned. I think, if anything, they might consider it a victory. So this reflects a broader splinternet. Last week, or a couple of weeks ago, we talked about TikTok and the US attempt to nationalize TikTok and a Cold War, economic Cold War, tech Cold War with China. Are we seeing then? A book was written a few years ago called Splinternet. A lot of people have always warned about this. Are we seeing the long-term fragmentation of the internet? I mean, we already know that there's a Russian internet, an Iranian internet, a Chinese internet. Is there about to become a European internet as well?
That is the obvious consequence of everything that's going on, you know, which would, I believe, be a terrible outcome for humanity. But that is the trend. The trend is for governments to try to police and control the digital presence inside their borders with a set of rules that the companies have to abide by. And that goes for mergers and acquisitions, as well as it does for rules, as well as it does for privacy. I mean, it's really everything. So if you're an executive at a big tech firm in 2024, your life is significantly harder than it was, you know, in 1994 when the internet first started, when authorities were, you know, not really a consideration.
No wonder it's raining in Palo Alto, Keith.
Yeah.
And what would this mean? I mean, this is a very speculative idea. I am still enormously skeptical that we'll even get close to this. But what would it mean to these global US tech leviathans like Apple and Google and Facebook and Amazon if the internet splinters and then their main markets are really just left in the US?
Well, the US is measured by human beings, it's a fairly small percentage of the global market. Measured by money spent, it's a very big proportion. Asia collectively is bigger now than the US on both counts. And so if you were to think, the question was, what are the most important markets for big tech? I think the UK is still one. Outside of US and UK and Asia, India is a rising one, if you don't include that within Asia. And, for Apple, at least China is huge. So I think Europe, by which I mean the EU, is somewhat unimportant in the big picture. And that's just an economic reality. And that said, every government is copying what the EU is doing, because governments, in a way, they like rules and bureaucracy because that's what gives them their authority and their power. So there's a natural inclination, if you are a politician and a government, to emulate the EU. And I do think that's happened in India, for example, with TikTok. So it's a very, very difficult navigation if you're an executive of big tech. And it's one of the reasons I believe that citizens using these technologies, they're kind of creating a bottoms-up globalization that doesn't really have anything to do with these top-down government bureaucracies. And I think ultimately users will have the power to force the politicians to keep their hands off the tools that
Although we have, and we have, this is not an issue this week, but we've talked about it in the past. We will in the future about initiatives to take smartphones and social media out of the hands of kids, not just in Europe, but in the US. What about AI? Is that going to change anything? One interesting piece of AI news this week is that Amazon is doubling down on its investment in Anthropic, one of the most independent of credible AI platforms, completing a $4 billion investment. Last week, we talked about one AI company that now has been incorporated into Microsoft. Is AI changing this? How will that work?
Well, AI, again, is American-centric. So if you're sitting in Europe, where the rules are such that any half-intelligent entrepreneur leaves and comes to America, you're faced again in this next generation of technology with an American-centric innovation world, where most of the money is going to flow to the innovators. And so, Europe was the first to regulate AI. It just passed an act at the EU level about AI, which is effectively going to exclude Europe as being a reasonable place to build an AI company. Mistral is an exception. It's a French company, Mistral AI. So I think AI is just another example of global technology, largely centered here in the States, having to navigate governments in the rest of the world.
And what about the Amazon news? Does it speak, and I've written about this, we talked about it, about this really not being, this new AI boom isn't really a startup boom. It's a boom of top-down companies, highly capitalized companies. Does this reflect that, the fact that Anthropic now, I mean, how many players are there in the AI market in these broad platforms? There's Anthropic, there's OpenAI, there's Gemini, there's I guess Microsoft, although they're heavily invested in these other companies, there aren't any real startups.
Well, ultimately they're all startups, because the truth is, just like with mobile and with the cloud, the big companies are late to the game. Google won the search wars as a startup because no one else was paying attention, and the smartphone turned Apple from a company that was borrowing money from Bill Gates into one that was bigger than Microsoft. So, Apple was almost bankrupt when it got that investment from Bill Gates. So the truth is, pretty much every generation of transformation is fueled by startups.
In the past, but the point is, it's all very well going back to Google, and you're right, of course, about that. But there isn't a Google in this AI market.
Well, yeah, there is. It's OpenAI, and OpenAI was a two-person startup originally. If you go back to 2015, and so the truth is that nobody believed it was possible to do anything close to what OpenAI launched last year until they launched it. And I don't know if you remember the gasping that went on with ChatGPT for version 1.
Yeah, it's interesting about, I mean, we can talk about this another time, but it's interesting with OpenAI that the reason they were successful is they took a Google white paper and developed it. So
yeah, now
in the same way, I guess, I'm sure Google originally borrowed ideas and white papers from Microsoft.
Yeah, where you're right. And by the way, that speaks to the importance of open intellectual debate, publishing, learning from each other. The world can't really innovate without knowledge. And so that cross knowledge is super important. Where I'm going to agree with you is the price of entry to AI is now too high for startups. Sequoia Capital this week did this offsite. My video of the week is from it. And it had many of the founders of these companies speaking. And they talked a lot about what comes next. It's about 4 hours worth of material, all on YouTube. And I strongly recommend anyone interested in AI go and look at it. But Andrew Ng, who is in the video of the week this week, is probably the most prescient, spoke at length about the next stage. Now, the next stage is multiple AIs being used by users against and for each other. And he talks about how, you could use Anthropic and give it outputs from ChatGPT and it will improve on them, and vice versa. You can even do self-referential. So you can go to ChatGPT and get an answer. You can give it its answer back immediately and say, can you improve on this? And it will. So the next stage is when AIs talk to AIs.
We've always had the promise, the next stage, it'll get more democratic. We will see, no doubt, but there still are real startups. One of them is Keith's startup of the week, a genuine startup, a small two-man shop that is building, or began as a small two-man shop like Google, I guess, building an all-electric intercity bus network in the UK, Ember. What is it about Ember that caught your fancy, Keith?
The entrepreneurialism of the founders. I mean, you wouldn't think that buying buses was a good startup idea because they're expensive. In this case, by the way, these buses are manufactured in China. They're less expensive than any equivalent they could find, and they're super high quality buses. And they're all electric. They can travel around 300 kilometers on a single charge. So it's city to city. The UK is a fairly small landmass. So you can get most places on a single charge on a bus. And they've started between two Scottish cities. They now have 34 buses in the field.
Is it a B2C company? Do they offer, is there a brand called Ember? You can buy a bus ticket?
Yeah, you buy a bus ticket, and it's got modern technology, like you can know where the bus is at any minute using your phone. So it's got Uber-like characteristics in software.
And who are they competing with? This is an old market. I assume it's an ideal opportunity for disruptive startups.
they're competing with large old-fashioned bus companies.
Yeah, I can imagine. So it's Uber
Yeah.
in a sense all over again.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
is it a big market? I mean, what's the market?
I think it's a big market in places where cities are close together, which is most of Europe. So I think it can be a pretty huge market. Yeah.
And what about the idea of an all electric intercity bus network in the US? I don't know if anyone remembers the last time you went to a bus station, intercity bus station in America, Keith. They're very depressing places.
Yeah. Well, the 42nd Street, New York, Manhattan bus station comes to mind, which I'm very familiar with. But there's others. I think American cities are too far apart. So until battery technology can take you roughly 600 miles, maybe 700, which it will, that's coming, then it's a little bit harder to imagine wanting to stop for 2 or 3 hours to recharge.
Yeah, and does Ember have recharging networks?
It just uses standard recharging networks that anyone could use.
So if you're going from, I don't know, Glasgow to the north, you have to stop to recharge the bus?
Not in the UK, because there aren't that many cities that are further apart than 300 miles.
Interesting. Well, we'll keep our eyes on that. Finally, X of the week. It's not Elon Musk. Nothing to do with Elon Musk. It's the acquisition of Affinity by Canva. Tell us about this and why. Again, in a sense, it's another startup of the week.
Yeah, I cheated. I wanted to make it startup of the week as well. Affinity is basically Adobe Photoshop and design tools, photo tools, and also Adobe Illustrator, which is a vector graphics tool. It's a British company that's built very, very high quality equivalents to those three pieces of software. And Canva is kind of like Figma that Adobe just failed to acquire due to regulations. So this is Canva, a startup, acquiring Adobe-like characteristics to compete with Adobe.
Yeah, a lot of the press was about this. Described Ars Technica described it as a non-subscription based weapon against Adobe. Is it a large market?
I paid a one-time fee of, I think it was $300 to buy the Affinity software about 3 years ago. All three, $99 per software piece. I use it because it's good, and I don't have to pay a subscription fee. So now every 3 or 4 years they create a whole new version, and they make me pay the $99 again. So they do get your money more than once, but it's several years apart.
Do you think Adobe is vulnerable on this front, not just in photo apps, but in video as well?
I think I think of Adobe as an old-fashioned company owning software that is going to go out of fashion at some point, or be commoditized in the way that Affinity is commoditizing. So, DaVinci Resolve is also already better than Adobe Premiere for video, as is Final Cut Pro, I think. So almost every single piece of software Adobe owns is being commoditized or cloudified by Figma, Canva, and others. So I don't see long run how Adobe survives unless it does what Microsoft has done successfully, which is transition to a different kind of company with different kinds of software. In the case of Microsoft, it's Azure, the cloud, business intelligence software, stuff that is really good and scales, that makes it compete with Amazon and Google and others.
So you're not particularly optimistic on Adobe. Interesting. And finally, Keith, both Ember, your startup of the week, Scottish-based company, and Affinity, they're British companies. Of course, you and I are British, so you have a particular knowledge of the British startup marketplace. You railed against the EU. Is post-Brexit Britain, is it a more innovative place? Would you have had Ember and Affinity in the UK if it was still part of the EU?
That's a hard question. I mean, the
All my questions are
I,
hard.
I will
That's
say,
why I asked them.
ultimately, I would come down to two people more than 10 years ago in the UK, Reshma Sahoni and Saul Klein, who set themselves the task with Seed Camp of turning London into something that's a bit more close to Silicon Valley in terms of business practice. They've been quite successful and catalyzed a whole set of developments that lead to these two companies and many others even existing. So I think the credit goes to people like that. The government self-consciously seems to want to encourage that in the UK now. Certainly not get in the way of it. And that's very strong in fintech, where the UK has sandboxes, which are basically software environments where, for example, banks or insurance companies are forced to make the interfaces available to developers to build new stuff that competes with them. So the UK does have a kind of a more open, competitive feel to it.
And certainly if in this dramatic worst case scenario, the big US tech companies decided to leave the EU, it would be a wonderful business opportunity for the UK.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.